In today's episode, we examine an Everest climb where these Sherpas knew this grandpa was going to die. Above 27,000 feet on Everest, a 68-year-old grandpa made a seemingly dumb decision that alarmed and shocked the Sherpas guiding him. What followed from that decision spiraled into an unimaginable result that no one on the mountain could stop. It was May 17, 2016, at Everest Base Camp. Snow had been falling intermittently for 3 days, coating the tent village in a fresh layer of white that muffled sound and shortened visibility to a few hundred feet. Overnight, temperatures dropped into the teens, cold enough to freeze water bottles solid, while daylight warmed the camp just enough that climbers moved between tents without full layering. The season was entering its critical window. Weather forecasts suggested a summit opportunity would open within the week, and expedition teams were finalizing their rotation schedules and oxygen allocations. Among the climbers preparing for the push was Walter Brennan, a 68-year-old retired orthopedic surgeon from Boulder, Colorado. He sat in the dining tent of his expedition company, studying a laminated map of the Lhotse face while nursing a cup of lukewarm tea. His hands, weathered and spotted with age, traced the route with the familiarity of someone who had spent a lifetime reading topographic lines. The other climbers in the tent were decades younger, most in their 30s and 40s, and they deferred to Walter with a respect that bordered on reverence. He was the eldest member of the expedition by nearly 20 years, and his resume demanded acknowledgement. Walter had begun climbing in 1966 at age 18 on the granite walls of El Dorado Canyon outside Boulder. By his mid-20s, he had established first ascents in the Tetons and completed technical routes in the Canadian Rockies that remained test pieces decades later. His medical career had taken him away from serious mountaineering during his 30s and 40s, but he had returned to the high peaks after his children left for college, systematically working through objectives he had dreamed about during long shifts in the operating room. Denali in 2003, Aconcagua in 2007, Cho Oyu in 2011, Manaslu in 2014. Each summit had required months of preparation and careful acclimatization, and each had reinforced his belief that age was a number, not a limitation. Everest was the last entry on a list he'd carried for decades. Every other mountain had been crossed off. Only Everest remained. His wife Eleanor had died of pancreatic cancer 14 months earlier. In the months that followed, Walter trained with an intensity that unsettled his adult children, part grief, part purpose. Eleanor had always believed he would stand on Everest one day. Finishing the climb without her felt like the only way to carry her with him. The expedition company accepted his application with minimal hesitation. On paper, Walter was experienced, fit, and fully paid. Their screening process measured credentials and capability, not the quiet deterioration of age or the psychological weight of climbing through grief. The lead Sherpa assigned to Walter's team was Mingma Dorje, 34 years old, with 11 Everest summits and a reputation for quiet competence. He had guided clients of varying abilities for 8 seasons, developing an intuitive sense for which climbers possessed the reserves necessary for the summit and which were operating on borrowed time. He rarely voiced these assessments directly. The expedition companies did not pay for opinions. They paid for logistics, rope fixing, load carrying, and the steady presence that kept clients moving upward. Judgments about client capability were made silently and acted upon only when circumstances forced the issue. Mingma first observed Walter on the trek from Lukla. Steady pace, controlled breathing, the calm efficiency of someone comfortable in the mountains. But the recovery was slower than it should have been. After steep sections, Walter needed longer pauses than he wanted to admit, and his appetite thinned early. These observations accumulated without being shared. Mingma mentioned nothing to the expedition leader or the other Sherpas, though he suspected they were making similar calculations. The system did not reward early warnings about paying clients. The concerns stayed internal, filed away until circumstances forced the issue. The acclimatization rotations began on May 5th. Camp 1 and back, then Camp 2 overnight, followed by a brief touch of Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, before returning to base camp to rest. Walter completed the first rotation without incident. He moved more slowly than the younger climbers, but his pace was consistent, and his condition upon return was acceptable. He ate dinner, slept 8 hours, and reported feeling strong the following morning. The expedition medic, a Nepali doctor contracted by the company, checked his oxygen saturation and found it within normal ranges for the altitude. There was no medical basis for concern. The second rotation revealed the first cracks. The climb to Camp 2 required crossing the Khumbu icefall in pre-dawn darkness, navigating the labyrinth of crevasses and unstable seracs, an objective hazard that has claimed plenty of lives over the decades. Walter's pace through the icefall was significantly slower than during the approach, his movements deliberate to the point of hesitation. At ladder crossings, he paused longer than other climbers, testing each step before committing his weight. The climbers behind him waited without complaint, but the delays were noted. Mingma climbed directly behind Walter through the icefall, close enough to assist if needed. He watched the older man's crampon placement, the way his legs trembled slightly on the steeper sections, the increasing frequency of his rest stops. At the top of the icefall, where the route flattened into the western CWM, Walter sat down heavily on his pack and did not move for nearly 10 minutes. His face was gray beneath his glacier glasses, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that took too long to normalize. Mingma offered water. Walter accepted it with a shaking hand and drank slowly. When he spoke, his voice was thin, stripped of the confident timbre it had carried at base camp. He mentioned that the altitude was taking its toll, that rest at Camp 2 would help. Mingma nodded without agreeing. He had heard similar reassurances from clients who never reached the summit and from clients who never came down. At Camp 2 that evening, Walter ate half a bowl of soup and disappeared into his tent. His absence was noted, but not questioned. At altitude, even warning signs often pass as routine. Mingma spoke quietly with Pasang Nuru, another experienced Sherpa assigned to the expedition, while the clients talked among themselves. The conversation was brief and conducted in Nepali, away from ears that might misunderstand. Mingma expressed his observation that the older American was deteriorating faster than expected. Pasang agreed. He had noticed the same patterns during the day's climb, the same warning signs that experience had taught them to recognize. They discussed what might happen if the deterioration continued. They did not discuss intervening. The decision to climb or descend belonged to the client, and ultimately, to the expedition leader. The Sherpas would do what they were paid to do. The third rotation was scheduled for May 12th. Walter rested at base camp for 4 days before the push, spending most of his time in his tent, reading and sleeping, and forcing himself to eat meals he did not want. He emerged for the climb, looking thinner than he had 2 weeks earlier, his cheekbones more prominent, the skin beneath his eyes darker and more hollow. The other climbers offered encouragement. Ian Whitfield reviewed the plan and confirmed that conditions looked favorable. No one suggested that Walter should reconsider. The ascent to Camp 3 required climbing the Lhotse face, a steep wall of blue ice that rose roughly 2,300 vertical feet above Camp 2 at angles that often hovered around 40 degrees and steepened in sections. Fixed ropes provided security, but the climbing demanded sustained effort. Each step kicked into firm snow or ice, each pull on the rope drawing from reserves that altitude was steadily depleting. Strong climbers reached Camp 3 in 4 to 5 hours. Walter took nearly 8. Mingma stayed with him the entire way. He watched Walter stop every 50 feet to catch his breath, watched his crampon kicks grow weaker as the hours passed, watched the determination in his eyes harden into something that looked less like resolve and more like desperation. At one point, roughly 2/3 up the face, Walter's legs buckled without warning. He caught himself on the fixed rope, his Jumar locking against the downward force. But for a moment, he simply hung there, his body refusing to respond to commands his mind was still issuing. Mingma moved to his side and steadied him by the shoulder. He offered the option to descend, carefully and without judgment. Walter refused immediately. His jaw stayed clenched, his eyes fixed upslope, and his focus narrowed into something personal, less about the route and more about a promise he believed waited above. Mingma didn't know the name behind that promise yet, but he recognized the force driving it. He had seen grief push climbers before. It rarely pushed them anywhere good. They reached Camp 3 at 4:30 p.m., hours behind schedule. Walter collapsed into his tent and did not emerge for dinner. Mingma checked on him twice during the evening, finding him conscious but distant, wrapped in his sleeping bag with his breathing shallow. Walter had a small fingertip pulse oximeter in his kit. Most clients did, and he tried to get a reading with hands that were already cold and poorly perfused. The numbers jumped and stalled the way they often do at altitude, useless until Mingma had him warm his fingers and sit up long enough to breathe steadily. The best reading they could coax out of it was still ugly. Mingma didn't diagnose him out loud. He simply helped Walter seat the mask properly, check the regulator for ice, and if Walter was going to use oxygen at all that night, kept it within the plan they'd been given. Because at Camp 3, fine and not fine can look identical until it's too late. That night, while the wind battered the tents and the temperature dropped toward -20, Mingma made his assessment final. In his experience, the American was extremely unlikely to survive a summit attempt. His body was failing in ways that willpower could not override. The reserves that carried younger climbers through the death zone simply did not exist in a 68-year-old frame that had already given everything it had. The math was simple and merciless. The summit was still 5,500 feet above them. The death zone began in less than 3,000 feet. Walter had taken 8 hours to climb 2,200 feet of fixed rope. He would run out of time, oxygen, and strength long before he reached the top. Mingma shared this assessment with Pasang and with Dawatashi, a third Sherpa who would be part of the summit team. They listened without argument. They had reached the same conclusion independently. The question was what to do with the knowledge. The answer, unspoken but understood, was nothing. Walter was a paying client. He had signed waivers acknowledging the risks. He had the legal right to continue until he chose to stop or until conditions made continuation impossible. The Sherpas would accompany him as far as he could go. They would not force a decision he was unwilling to make. Hey, quick reminder, if stories like this hold your attention, where experience, ambition, and risk quietly collide, you can subscribe to see more. Your support keeps this channel going. Now let's get back to the mountain. The summit window opened on May 17th. Weather reports indicated a 36-hour period of reduced wind and clear skies, narrow but sufficient for teams staged at Camp 4 to make their attempts. Climbers who had been waiting for weeks began moving upward, a slow procession of colored suits against the white expanse of the Lhotse face. Walter was among them. He had rested at base camp for 3 days after the third rotation. Under the expedition medic's supervision, he did a couple of short, low-flow oxygen sessions and one brief run in a Gamo bag, the portable hyperbaric bag teams keep for serious altitude illness. A stopgap meant to buy rest, appetite, and sleep, not fix acclimatization. The intervention restored some color to his face and improved his saturation readings. When he emerged from his tent on the morning of the summit push, he looked better than he had in weeks. His voice was stronger. His movements were more fluid. Ian Whitfield noted the improvement and expressed confidence that Walter was ready. The observation was based on appearance rather than assessment. It was enough to justify proceeding. The climb from base camp to Camp 4 took 2 days, with an overnight at Camp 2. Walter moved slowly but steadily, pacing himself with the discipline of someone who understood that the real test lay ahead. He ate more than he had during previous rotations, forcing down calories his body needed, even when his stomach rebelled. He slept poorly, but slept, which was more than many climbers managed at altitude. By the time he reached Camp 4 on the South Col at 26,000 feet, he appeared to have stabilized. Camp 4 sat exposed on the South Col, wind-scoured and hostile even on good days. The summit window had delivered manageable wind, clear skies, the pyramid visible against the dark. Walter waited on low-flow oxygen while Mingma checked the equipment. The time for conversation had passed. What remained was execution. At 11:45 p.m., Mingma woke Walter and helped him prepare for departure. The older man moved stiffly, his joints protesting against the cold and the altitude, but he managed the familiar sequence of layering and buckling and checking without assistance. His oxygen mask was fitted and tested. His headlamp was activated and positioned. His harness was clipped to the fixed line that led up toward the triangular face. At 12:15 a.m. on May the 18th, Walter Brennan began his final climb. The first 2 hours went better than Mingma expected. Walter maintained a slow but consistent pace, his crampons finding purchase on the wind-scoured ice, his Jumar sliding up the rope with each deliberate step. The line of headlamps stretched above and below them, a vertical constellation of climbers, all moving toward the same invisible point. The cold was brutal, -30 degrees with wind chill, but Walter's layering held, and his extremities remained functional. He did not speak. He did not stop until the line stopped. He simply climbed. The balcony arrived at 3:40 a.m., a small platform at 27,600 feet, where climbers traditionally rested before the final push. Walter lowered himself onto a rock and sat motionless, his chest heaving, his head bowed forward. Mingma checked his oxygen supply and found it lower than optimal, the consumption rate elevated by the effort of the climb. He replaced the bottle with a fresh one, working quickly in the darkness, his fingers clumsy inside heavy gloves. Walter's condition had deteriorated noticeably during the climb. His movements became mechanical, and the coordination that looked normal at lower camps started to misfire in small ways. Fumbling his Jumar, taking a half-step sideways before correcting, pausing with his hand on the rope as if he'd forgotten what came next. When Mingma checked in, Walter's responses arrived late, sometimes several seconds behind the question, his brain struggling to keep pace with simple decisions. Pasang arrived at the balcony with another client and immediately moved to confer with Mingma. The conversation was brief and private, conducted while Walter sat unmoving on his rock. Pasang observed that the American was not going to make it. Mingma agreed. They discussed the turnaround time, the point at which they would be obligated to force a descent regardless of the client's wishes. The company protocol specified 1 p.m. as the latest acceptable summit time. Any later risked descending into darkness without adequate oxygen reserves. It was currently 3:45 a.m. The summit was approximately 4 hours away for a healthy climber. For Walter, it would take longer. The math remained unfavorable. The climb above the balcony steepened. The route traversed a ridge of mixed rock and ice, exposed on both sides to drops that disappeared into darkness. Walter's pace slowed further. He stopped every 30 steps, sometimes every 20, his body demanding rest that his mind refused to acknowledge. Other climbers passed them, moving with purpose toward the summit that was now tantalizingly close. They glanced at Walter as they passed. Some offered words of encouragement. Most said nothing. Everyone understood what they were seeing. At 6:15 a.m., as gray light began to illuminate the upper mountain, Walter stopped and did not immediately resume. He was standing on a narrow section of the ridge, his Jumar clipped to the fixed rope, his body swaying slightly in the wind. Mingma reached him within seconds and placed both hands on his shoulders to stabilize him. Walter's eyes were unfocused behind his glacier glasses. His breathing was rapid and shallow. When Mingma asked what was wrong, Walter did not respond. He simply stood there, staring at something no one else could see. This was the moment Mingma had been expecting. The altitude had finally overwhelmed the older man's compensatory mechanisms. His brain was starving for oxygen, his judgment compromised, his body running on reserves that had long since been depleted. A healthy climber would turn around immediately. Walter did not appear capable of making that decision. Mingma slowed his voice and reduced the problem to basics: time, oxygen, and the strength required to come back down. He repeated the key points until Walter's unfocused attention locked onto them. Then he gave the clearest off-ramp he could offer: descend now, while the margin still existed. Walter's response came slowly, as if dragged through fog. The summit was close enough that it had become an obsession. He fixated on the idea that stopping would make the entire expedition meaningless. He kept returning to the same thought, the same person, the same promise, something waiting at the top that mattered more to him than the risk below his feet. Mingma looked to Pasang and saw the small head movement that confirmed what they both already knew. The decision was no longer theirs to influence. They continued upward. The next 2 hours were a slow-motion deterioration. Walter's steps became shuffles, his feet barely clearing the snow before setting down again. His rest stops extended to minutes, then longer. He fell twice, catching himself on the fixed rope each time, his body crumpling against the snow before struggling upright with Mingma's assistance. His oxygen consumption accelerated as his body fought to maintain function, the bottles draining faster than the careful calculations had assumed. At 8:30 a.m., approximately 400 feet below the summit, Walter collapsed and could not rise. He lay on the snow, his chest heaving, his eyes closed behind his fogged glasses. Mingma knelt beside him and checked his pulse. It was rapid and weak, the heartbeat of a body approaching its limits. He checked the oxygen supply. The current bottle was nearly empty. One bottle remained. Other climbers passed them on the descent, having summited earlier in the morning. They offered assistance that Mingma declined. 2 more bodies would not make the situation better. What Walter needed was lower altitude, warmer temperatures, and medical care that did not exist above 28,000 feet. What Walter needed was to have made a different decision hours ago. Mingma made the call that should have been made at the balcony. They were descending immediately. He communicated this to Walter, who did not respond, and to Pasang, who began preparing the older man for movement. Together they lifted Walter to his feet and clipped him to the rope between them. He would descend supported, his weight partially carried by the Sherpas. his movements guided by hands that had performed this service before. The descent began at 8:45 a.m. Progress was agonizingly slow. Walter's legs functioned intermittently, sometimes supporting his weight, sometimes giving way without warning. The Sherpas compensated as best they could, absorbing the stumbles, maintaining the forward momentum that was the only thing keeping their client alive. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose from deadly to merely dangerous. The wind remained manageable, small mercies. At approximately 27,800 feet, roughly an hour into the descent, Walter's legs stopped working entirely. He slumped against the fixed rope, his full weight suspended by his harness, and the grip of the two Sherpas flanking him. His eyes were open but unseeing. His breathing had become irregular, with long pauses followed by shallow gasps. Mingma recognized the pattern. He had seen it before, in climbers whose bodies had simply given up. They tried to continue the descent. Carrying an unconscious man down technical terrain was theoretically possible, but practically devastating. Each step required coordination between three bodies, two of which were exhausted and one of which was unresponsive. The fixed rope helped, providing a guide and an anchor, but the angle of the slope and the loose snow made every movement treacherous. After 20 minutes of struggle, they had covered less than 100 feet. At 10:15 a.m., at an altitude of approximately 27,650 feet, Walter Brennan stopped breathing. Mingma checked for a pulse at the neck and found nothing he could trust. No steady beat, no rhythm that returned when he waited and checked again. He cleared the mask, checked the airway the best he could through frozen straps and layers, and called Walter's name, loud then louder, as if volume could pull someone back. For a few seconds he tried compressions anyway. More reflex than logic, then stopped. On a narrow ridge at nearly 8,500 meters, CPR is almost always futile. Nothing changed. Walter's eyes stayed open, fixed on the blue sky above the ridge. They sat with him for several minutes. There was nothing else to do. The mountain had made its decision, and the decision was final. Walter had climbed as high as his body would allow, and then higher, driven by something stronger than survival instinct, chasing a summit that had never really been about the mountain at all. Mingma radioed base camp at 10:23 a.m., reporting the death and their position on the descent route. Ian Whitfield received the call with practiced calm, asked for details, logged the coordinates, and confirmed that recovery would be considered when conditions allowed. The body would likely remain where it was. Most bodies did. The Sherpas descended without their client, reaching Camp 4 by afternoon and base camp the next morning. The expedition absorbed the news with the muted grief common to high-altitude losses, sadness tempered by the understanding that everyone on the mountain had accepted this possibility. An investigation later cited high-altitude cerebral edema, complicated by exhaustion and age, and the company released a statement noting that all safety protocols had been followed. Mingma's earlier observations were not requested. In Walter's tent, among his personal effects, a weathered list of mountains was found, every name crossed off except Everest, beside which someone had added a short note in handwriting that wasn't his. The list was returned to his children with his wedding ring and photographs. They learned later that he had spoken often of their mother, that he had believed finishing the list would bring him closer to her, and that he had known the risks and accepted them. The mountain had not killed Walter Brennan. It had simply been the place where he chose to stop climbing. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.